The Battle of the Bulge. On December 16th, 1944, the German army surprises the Allies by attacking in the Ardennes Mountains of Belgium, France, and Luxembourg. The Battle of the Bulge begins. As the Allies advance, this was thought to be Hitler's last attempt to stop the Allies as they advance into mainland Germany. As fighting ensues, heavy snowstorms hit the battleground, and American soldiers battle not just with the Germans, but with terrible conditions and freezing temperatures.
Bulge. Command broke down, supplies broke down, morale broke down, communications broke down, everything broke down. It was every man for himself. We were inadequately clothed. We didn't have rubber overshoes. We didn't have overcoats. We didn't have gloves. We didn't have scarves. My boots were so bad, I would strip newspapers and drapery off of these bombed out houses and wrap my feet in it. You were having trouble breathing because the snow was suffocating you. And consequently, we lost a lot of men who froze to death.
Eventually, the Allies will send airdrops to the battlefield to ensure that American and British forces would remain on the battlefield to fight against the Germans. The Germans wouldn't have the same luck, though. Eventually, the German offensive runs out of fuel, ammunition, and manpower. The Battle of the Bulge was so important because this was Hitler's last offensive. Hitler was using his last main reserve forces to attack the Allies, to halt their advance, instead of sitting back in Germany and waiting for them to come. This was a huge, monumental attack that would change the course of the war in the Allies' favor. Many historians would argue that the Battle of the Bulge was a huge mistake. Instead of saving their forces for the battle in Germany, they wasted them on a pointless attack, knowing they would run out of fuel and their war machine would be devastated. But at this time, both the Allies and the Soviets were surrounding the Germans, and Hitler was desperate for a win. And perhaps his ego got in the way of his military planning, which costed him this battle, and maybe the Western Front. Here's a little bit of a taste into what Hitler's thinking was going into the battle and how his forces would try to stop the American forces.
Hitler had been planning for a major counteroffensive in the West ever since the Allies had broken out from their beachheads. It was his belief that a well-placed and well-timed attack could cripple the Western Allies and would allow him to divert his attention to a much larger threat in the East. If he were to succeed, however, he would need vast numbers of men and equipment, much of which he did not have. He had lost irreplaceable men and equipment in the West already, and his reserves were quickly dwindling. He authorized the creation of new armies comprised of children, old men, the sick, and the crippled. To arm his new troops, he pushed factories to their limits, with German production being at its highest in 1944 than any other year. Unknown to the Allies, Hitler had begun assembling huge sums of troops and equipment in the Ardennes region. Secrecy was absolute, with only the highest of officers even knowing about it. He entrusted command of the operation to General Fieldmarschall Walter Model and Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt.
The Germans threw 250,000 soldiers into the initial assault. 14 German infantry divisions guarded by 5 panzer divisions against a mere 80,000 Americans. Their assault came in an early morning at the weakest part of the Allied line, an 80-mile poorly protected stretch of hilly wooded forests. The Allies simply believed the Ardennes too difficult to traverse and therefore an unlikely location for a German offensive. And it was between the vulnerability of the thin, isolated American units and the thick fog that prevented the Allied air cover from discovering German movement. The Germans were able to push the Americans into retreat. One particular German offensive trick was the use of English-speaking German commandos who infiltrated the American lines and using captured U.S. uniforms, trucks, and jeeps. German troops impersonated U.S. military and sabotaged communications. The ploy caused widespread chaos and suspicion among American troops as to the identity of the fellow soldiers. Even after the ruse was discovered, even General Omar Bradley himself had to prove his identity 3 times by answering questions about football. The battle raged for 3 weeks, resulting in a massive loss of American and civilian life. Nazis' atrocities abundant, including the murder of 72 Americans soldiers by SS in the Ardennes town of Malmedy. Historian Stephen M. Ambrose estimated that by the war's end, of the 600,000 GLS involved, almost 20,000 were killed, another 20,000 were captured, and 40,000 were wounded. The U.S. had the second largest surrender in the entire war. More than 1,500 troops surrendered in the Ardennes by German forces. But eventually, as we know, the Allies would turn the tide and the weather would improve, which allowed American aircraft to bomb German targets, and eventually the United States would be the victor because they had more supplies than the Germans ran out, and their war machine suffered as a result of that. After this battle, it seemed like nothing could stop the Allies as their march continued into mainland Germany, both for the British and American forces and for the Soviets on the Eastern Front.